This Saturday, the UFA Game of the Week features the DC Breeze and the New York Empire. It's the next chapter of this epic East Division rivalry, with massive implications for seeding and home field advantage in the upcoming playoffs. Opening poll set for Saturday at 6 p.m. and broadcast exclusively on WatchUFA.tv.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock returning from the road. We have reached the end of the 2024 UFA regular season, and what a finale we have coming up in the week 13 ahead. This episode will preview all of the scintillating action, including 3 of the 4 divisions still yet to be settled at the top as far as who will get the number 1 seed going into the playoffs. That is in the East, South, and West divisions. All will have head-to-head matchups this coming weekend to determine those slots. Additionally, Cameron's own Indianapolis Alley Cats will be going on the road to face the Radicals in Madison at Breese Stevens Field for a do or die, win or be eliminated Central Division showdown between 2 of the league's oldest franchises. We've never had a regular season finish like this within the association. We've had a lot of late season, I think 3-seed wild card finishers, sort of drama, but nothing so up in the air, so much upheaval, so much uncertainty heading into the playoffs. I mean, even extending beyond just the week 13 schedule, we have no real clue which team is going to emerge from any of these 4 divisions currently at this point in the season.
It's chaos. It's the chaos season, as you've alluded to so many times this year. And it's so strange to have this much up in the air this late in the season. Typically, by the last week, we at minimum know the playoff teams, maybe not the seeding. And in a lot of cases, we know the 1 seeds, but it's really a matter of who's the 2, 3, who's the 2, and who's the 3. And there are so many divisions where, first off, we don't even know all the playoff teams in the Central. And second off, like in some divisions, we still have no idea who the 1, 2, or 3 seed are. So, looking at you, East, where it could be literally anything, it is unmatched by any other season. It's not even close. And it just kind of seems like the stars have aligned with the schedule. There are so many times where you get to the last week and it's, some teams really have nothing to play for, and have already locked off their playoff spot. And you kind of wonder if they're even going to play all their guys. And, the stars have really aligned this year for all these games we have between like the top 2 teams in a division that are going to decide first place. And I think in a year where the league feels pretty wide open in terms of who could win the title, I think that just makes that first round bye that much more important, because if this year has taught us anything, I think it's that any of the teams making the playoffs have the capability of beating any of the other teams in their division. So this is not your standard year where the 1 seed is just like far better than the 3 seed in their division. I really think in pretty much all 4 divisions, maybe the South would be the one I'd say I'd feel the least confident in, but I feel like in the other 3 especially, you could see any team beat anybody, and I would not be surprised.
It really is that kind of parity that has defined the entire season and really lends to what an amazing set of matchups we have upcoming. I mentioned the Central Division slate between Indy and Madison, but more importantly, I think are the top of division, first place deciding matchups in the East, the South, and the West. You've got 9-2 DC at 8-3 New York. DC has won 5 straight. New York has won 4 straight. Those 2 teams will take battle on Saturday night in the game of the week, July 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern on WatchUFA TV. And then in the South Division, you have 9-2 Carolina at 9-2 Atlanta. It's the 3rd meeting between these 2 teams. Carolina still holds the season series edge 2-1 over the Hustle, but Atlanta has looked like the best team in the league over the past month plus. They have won 8 straight, including last week's skin of their teeth, last second of regulation, Brett Hulsmeyer buzzer beater to walk it off in the A-Town. Hustle look to be surging going into this matchup, but they are down a couple of notable defensive starters. We'll get to that in the preview. And then I think one of the most just exhilaratingly exciting matchups we've had in quite some time, something that's come out from under, almost like a flower that grows on the side of your house that you weren't quite expecting, is this West Division to decide the 1 seed matchup between 8-2 Seattle playing at 9-2 Salt Lake being the reigning West Division champs themselves. Shred have played like the best team in that division throughout this season, but with the Cascades taking advantage of a somewhat weaker schedule, this game is for all the marbles out there. It would be quite a usurpation. Is that the word? I don't know. It would be usurping for Seattle to take the divisional title game as their own home matchup if they get this win. And also, if they take care of business on Sunday at Portland, Cascades have a sneaky day off, but still road doubleheader in week 13. Another kind of sneaky double road header to pay attention to is Boston at Toronto and then at Montreal. Glory just escaping with the skin of their teeth as well just a couple weekends ago in Montreal in overtime. There's just kind of grittiness and I think purchase in almost any matchup going into this week 13 slate that is absolutely loaded, as we keep repeating ourselves saying.
Yeah, I love this. Like we were talking in the pre-show, like I wish our game was at a slightly different time, like an hour earlier, so I could catch the whole Seattle Salt Lake game live. I will be running probably straight to my phone to like turn that game on as soon as our game with Madison's concluded, and trying to catch the second half, because I mean these games are they're all exciting. They all feel like the playoffs have started already. I know you and Daniel mentioned this on the recap pod, and it really feels like the playoffs start this week for like the entire league, because there's so much at stake for so many teams.
Yeah. And so let's get right into it. We've got so much to cover. Let's start with, I think, the biggest entree on the whole table, the game of the week matchup. Again, 9-2 DC at 8-3 New York. DC won the first matchup between these two teams earlier this season, 16-14 on June 8th. It was the first win for DC against New York since 2021. Empire had won 6 in a row up until the point earlier in 2024. But as has been discussed outside of just this podcast, the Empire were down numerous starters in their loss earlier in DC. They now take the home matchup in week 13, and this seems to be the strongest roster for the Empire we have seen so far this season. This is absolutely the kind of lineup that the two-time reigning champions can flex on anybody. John Randolph, who has missed a couple of weeks with a concussion, is active. Marquez Brownlee, who was out with the flu last weekend, he's in there. They've got Antoine Davis, Ben Yacht, Jack Williams, Elliot Chartok, Oliver Chartok. Like, this thing is loaded for the Empire, and they are ready to take on a DC team that is also surging and really, I think, wants to assert itself as not just being a team that took advantage and was a little bit fluky over their earlier win this season against the Empire.
Yeah, and Oliver Chartok is coming off an incredible game up in Minnesota too. You can't replace a Ryan Osgar, right? Like you're not going to find like a 1-for-1, but the way Chartok is playing recently, it feels like he's kind of in his own way assuming that role of a guy that can hurt you with his throws, but also just beat you all over the field. And I think that was on full display in Minnesota at TCO Stadium this past week. By the way, can I just tell you how depressing it is when I like go to these guys' pages and I see like, oh, this person was born a full decade after I was.
Oh, get over it, old man.
I know. But man, I mean, New York is playing so well. And one of the things is during these last several games when they've been playing so well, they've been doing that without being at full strength. They've been missing guys like John Randolph hasn't played in any of those games. They've been missing SRB for a game or two in there. Like, they've been doing all this not with their top 20. And that is just so incredibly impressive. I really loved the shout out that Daniel gave to Angelo Olsese and his play, because he's not someone we've talked about at all this year, and he played phenomenally well. Just being that guy who just continually helped get the disc where it needed to be. Um, Throughout the entire game. I mean, I think he went like 30 for 30 on throwing, and that is not a stadium that is, one you go into where 30 for 30 is going to be an easy day. Like, it's the wind is swirly, you get the disc up too high, it's just going to get taken to places you definitely don't want it to go. Um, the last time we saw the Breeze, they were kicking the crap out of Carolina, and probably what I would say is the most shocking result of the entire season, in terms of not just them winning wasn't shocking, but the way in which they dominated Carolina start to finish in that game and nearly doubled them up. They've had the last couple weeks off, so you kind of might forget about the Breeze because their schedule was so front loaded. So it's really hard. I feel like the Empire being at home and continuing to build momentum over the last few weeks as they continued to play. Of course, in my mind, that makes them the favorite, but I have to keep in mind just how great DC looked the last time we saw them.
So speaking of how great both teams look coming into this, again, both teams orchestrating winning streaks, getting into this matchup. These are two teams that are top 3 in offensive efficiency, top 4 in fewest turnovers per game, and top 4 in fewest goals allowed. These are truly pedigreed title contenders in the 2024 season, and they are going to be at full tilt running towards each other. I wanted to talk a bit about what you mentioned a second ago about kind of the emergence of Oliver Chartok with the absence of Ryan Osgar this season, to say nothing of Jeff Babbitt and going and playing for a division rival in Boston. This Empire team has worked out from underneath a tremendous set of circumstances, I think, befalling a 2-time reigning champion in the Empire. We spent so much of the last bit of the offseason and even the first couple weeks talking about how different this Empire team looked, how they really lacked explosiveness, about how they were missing Babbitt and Osgar and Lithiau and Katz and some of these other pieces that had been so integral to this team's success in back-to-back undefeated seasons, and what existed at one point as a 31-game winning streak, that sort of defined this entire dynasty. And for them to mid-season shift from all of that acclaim and sort of heliocentric team building to this newer version that still has all of that championship core and experience and knowledge, but is so much better at interchanging roles and I'm going to moneyball it here, assembling things in the aggregate. You talk about you can't directly replace Ryan Osgar, and yet New York is getting it done kind of by synergizing multiple pieces. And I just got to say, personally, I've detested the Bill James sort of moneyballification of roster building and stuff. I don't believe in that stuff a lot of times. I actually think the examples that they gave in that movie and that book suck, because it completely omits the fact that was an athletics team that had like Barry Zito, Mark Mulder, Tim Hudson, and they had Eric Chavez and Miguel Tejada. They're talking about these role players, replacing Johnny Damon leaving for the Yankees or something. Like, it's hogwash, right? Like, they still had stars on that team that were excelling, and they simply got role players emerging into roles. So I've always kind of been a skeptic of this. You can get by replacing a star through getting aggregate sort of efficiency pieces. And yet I look at this New York team this year, and that's exactly what they're doing, right? Like, Jeff Babbitt is still playing like an MVP in Boston. Ryan Osgar is certainly a missed piece of this. You can see it at times. And yet they go to Minnesota and they just punch a very good defense in the mouth, just run it down their throats, so to speak, in the red zone. 2 matchups ago, they just dismantle Salt Lake coming over from the West. I mean, this team might lack some of the luster and, again, like star-faced appeal that we're used to at the Empire. But, man, they still pack a punch. Man, they still look like a team I don't know that I'm choosing against in any playoff game right now.
Yeah, to continue with the baseball metaphor, I guess it's like they went from being the Bronx Bombers, the New York Yankees teams that just had a murderer's row of home run hitters. We're dating ourselves a little bit. Like
Yeah, we are. We are.
late,
We really
I'm
are.
talking like late '90s, early 2000s when hitting 30 home runs was still kind of a big deal.
Okay,
Uh,
I have one more Moneyball rant. They made the Minnesota freaking Twins look out to be like some dark empire bad guy team in the Moneyball movie. Like, we were the underdogs, man. I love that Twins team. I can't believe they made them out to be this like, oh, we got taken down by the mighty Minnesota Twins. Just small
yeah,
market on small market slander.
yeah. Let the peons fight amongst each other, right?
Right?
But like that's what it feels like. They went from being like the Bronx Bombers to like I'll go with my Chicago White Sox in '05 when they won the World Series, where it was a
Ooh,
lot
there's
of
an
like,
obscure one.
yeah, where it was like, and nobody, that team's so obscure that when ESPN was recounting all the Chicago titles that had happened since the last Cubs World Series win, they actually forgot to put the White Sox World Series win on there, which was hilarious. But that team was built on like base running and pitching. Like, they had the best pitching in the league. They ran they had the leader in stolen bases, and then they had a couple of stars. It feels like that's what the Empire is right now. Like they're not winning with home runs anymore. They're winning with good base running and singles, and advancing when they can. And I think what we've seen is, at the beginning of the year they were really having a lot of issues throwing the disc deep, and sometimes it was very clear they were trying to like force the disc deep to Benyat, and he'd be going up flat footed with two or three defenders around him. And as good as Benyat is in the air, where he really shines is when he's in movement already. And I don't care who you are. If you're waiting for a disc to come to you and you have two or three defenders coming with momentum, you are at a disadvantage. And we've seen that they've really been able to rein it in. They were towards the bottom of the league in huck percentage. They've moved themselves up to the middle, which might not seem like that big of a deal, but keeping in mind that they had to fight against where they had started from, they've actually been one of the best hucking teams over the last few weeks, which they actually put on full display last week in Minnesota, where I believe they only missed on like one huck attempt, if I remember correctly.
They were 7 of 8. And when you say best hucking teams, I do want to qualify it. They've been one of the most efficient. They still don't really
They don't do a
press
lot.
teams deep. They take advantage of it when it's there.
Yeah, but that was something they couldn't do early in the season.
No, I mean, to your point, here's the first 3 games for the Empire. 3 of 12 against Montreal in their home opener. 5 of 11 when they lost by 5 against Atlanta. 1 of 3 when they won by 2 at Boston. I mean, just not being able to get anything going deep.
Yeah, and I can say the same for DC. DC, we've talked about the issues with hucking the disc. Them and the Empire basically squarely in the middle of the league right now in huck percentage, and that's really all they need is just to be a threat. And both teams have, early in the season, going back to last season, not a threat for the Breeze. Excuse me. But now they've figured out how to strike deep and when to strike deep, but also that they don't need to rely on it because they are so good in the short game. This really is, I mean, the East Division really is 3 teams that all don't really want to throw the disc deep a lot, but want to be really efficient when they do it. But they all excel at just keeping possessions alive by continuing to reset the disc and look for opportunities to strike upfield. It's so funny how the meta has just shifted that way in the East.
Well, and I think this might be kind of a rock fight. I could see both teams taking a lot of time to move the disc into the red zone and just giving themselves handfuls of short field opportunities, because that's what the Breeze have been for a couple seasons now. They have 1, 2, 3, 4 games this season with 20 or more attempts inside the red zone, including that 25-13 win over Carolina when they punched in 20 out of 25 red zone opportunities against the Flyers, just absolutely running the ball down their throat. And the Empire have started to do that similarly in recent games, where they're just reliant on that super strong backfield plan, especially in this last weekend's game against Minnesota when they had the return of Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey, and just continue to use him in his most optimal state, which is being a pristine pivot handler in the middle of the field and just kind of getting the disc sideline to sideline with such smoothness and easiness and in the rhythm. Like both these teams really like to kind of give themselves T-ball opportunities on offense. And so for me, it then becomes a question of how do each of these defensive units dispossess the opposing O-lines from the disc? How do they sort of thwart them? I think you saw a really interesting strategic adjustment for the Empire against Salt Lake a couple weekends ago, where they wanted to kind of attack a Salt Lake team that loves to play confidently and move quickly and engage its first looks. And you could see the Empire building a wall at the front of a lot of Salt Lake possessions and kind of complicating those first few passes. I think DC's got a few more wrinkles in their ability to initiate quickly. I mean, we've just seen that so much over the years with their diamond style of offense that sort of originates in the back with Andrew Roy and then just immediately moves kind of up through the first, second, third levels until they're just running on you fast breakdown field. It feels like so many times. I think that DC has shown numerous times that they're confident in doing that against the Empire. And so to me, is it just down to the Empire getting some individual standout performances from, Antoine Davis, John Randolph, Brenton Tan, something like that? Or is there some kind of, again, strategic development or instrument that the Empire can employ against this DC offense that just continues to be year after year, I think, the most consistent offensive unit in the league?
I think in both situations, this might sound a little counterintuitive, but both offenses are so good at just like completing the next pass, whether that's a reset or a short under or whatever, that I feel like one of the things you have to do on defense is actually kind of remain patient. Because what can happen when you're in these like long grindy possessions where the offense is completing 20 plus passes, one thing that often happens is a defender either loses their focus and kind of ends up losing their person because the point's just been going on for a while, or they get a little over aggressive and then they allow an opening for the offense and then it's just kind of off to the races. Usually results in a pretty quick score. I think both defenses kind of just have to like dig in and be okay with the possessions taking a long time and then just capitalizing once they get the disc, because mistakes will happen, right? Like if you just stay true to like what you're trying to accomplish on defense, eventually, right, both sides get worn down. And when both sides get worn down, it does sometimes become a little bit of an advantage defense, because if both sides are being, really patient and just sticking to their game plans, what ends up happening eventually is the onus becomes on the offense, because they're the ones who have to keep executing the cuts and the throws, where defensively, if you're on somebody and the guy you're guarding just gets a little tired and wants to take one cut off, like that's kind of the moment when the offense starts to break down. So I've seen, even with New York sometimes getting a little aggressive on defense and then they end up fouling or allowing the off, which gives the offense yards, allows them to catch their breath and kind of reset. And I think I really think both sides just need to wait and pick their spots, because this is going to be a low turnover game. I know I said this before about a game that ended up being a lot crazier, but I just feel like both teams, like once you reach about like, if you reach like 12 or 13 turnovers, you might be losing the game. Like I think that might be too much.
Yeah, I mean, these are again, two of the top four teams in fewest turns allowed per game. I think just to kind of dismount from the segment, I wanted to mention a few matchups that I think I'm really looking forward to for both teams. AJ Merriman on Ben Yacht has been something emerging over the past few seasons. Yacht has traditionally held the edge in that one-on-one, but Merriman has had his moments. He's gotten a hand block on Yacht in some pretty big games back in 2023, I think most notably. He also got a couple of blocks in the 2021 win over the Empire, so that's one to watch. I think Thomas Edmonds might either draw Jack Williams or possibly Charles Weinberg, if not Oliver Chartok. Oliver Chartok might be a little bit too much size for Thomas Edmonds, but Edmonds has been kind of a versatile piece that DC has been deploying on numerous types of offensive players. So it'll be interesting to see where he matches up. On the flip side, I'm really interested to see who the Empire elect to throw on rookie sensation Elliot Bonet. I think Antoine Davis drew that matchup most notably in their first meeting this season, got a layout block and a bookend score in transition. But Bonet has just been so impressive, I think, in his competitiveness throughout his first campaign in the association and just continues to be one of the top producers in the league. You've also got to watch out for, I think, Breton Tan, possibly on Johnny Malks, two just absolute A1 dogs there. You could just continue to go on. So I just want to mention a couple just to pay attention to, but really any one-on-one on either lineup between DC and New York is something that you can feast your eyes on. Again, that game of the week matchup will take place on Saturday night on watchufa.tv. We've got to keep moving on because there's just way too much to get to. So let's settle in on the top South matchup, 9-2 Carolina at 9-2 Atlanta. Atlanta, again, winning 8 straight times. Carolina getting back on track with 3 straight wins after dropping 2 in a row at DC and at Atlanta. But Carolina still looking a little off from where we saw them in the beginning part of the season. Remember, they were the last team to remain undefeated in the entire 2024 UFA calendar. But it feels like the Flyers are a little bit adrift from where we were assessing them, at like the beginning of June. They've had a couple of setbacks again against notably contendery teams. And I just think that there's something about their play style that seems to be a little hit or miss at this point. When those deep looks are connecting and they can run out in transition, they look phenomenal. I mean, the Flyers this season are still one of the top defenses in break rate. Their offense is loaded with star talent and playmakers. But in this particular matchup with Atlanta, and despite kind of the history between these two regional powerhouses, the Hustle feel like they have a decided edge. And I think there's a little bit of invincibility coming off of their last second, maybe we shouldn't have won this game last weekend against Dallas. I know the Legion are winless, but they gave Atlanta everything they could handle. The Hustle were down numerous starters. They'll be returning most of their lineup this weekend. But Atlanta are now winning in ways that aren't necessarily them crushing teams, but are also sort of the serendipitous ways in which you can kind of start to discern some teams as a championship contender. I feel like New York has had handfuls of these moments over the years, right? Like in each of their championship runs, they have these kind of last second victories that just, make you kind of smile and go, oh man, Jack Williams and Ben Yard at it again. And that's sort of the quality I felt last weekend with Bobby Lay's last second Hail Mary to Brett Halsmeyer. It's like, yep, those Atlanta boys just win in any way possible this year. And so I think heading into this final home game against their most fierce rivals, this is a terrific opportunity for the Hustle to kind of get one of the monkeys off their back. I think that they still have to do that in the playoffs for a franchise that's never made a championship weekend. But putting down Carolina in the regular season for a second straight year would be, I think, a big spiritual victory for this Atlanta franchise.
100%. I think especially coming off of a game where, they were very, I was absolutely shocked when I checked, the scores and saw that it was late in the third and Dallas was sporting a 2-goal lead at the time, I think. And it kind of made me scratch my head a little bit because, the Hustle were missing some guys, but like they still had enough there where you felt like Dallas is on the second day of a doubleheader. Atlanta still got most of their top dogs, notably missing a few, but things just looked a little off. And, Carolina, they didn't look great there for a stretch, losing to Atlanta pretty handily, getting crushed by DC, playing kind of lackluster the first half of their game in Pittsburgh. And I thought they played okay against Philly. Well, actually, they played pretty well against Philly. They only had 10 total turnovers in that game. And then they go and, they do what they're supposed to. They really take it to Dallas, beat them by 13 goals. And it kind of feels like maybe that was the okay, we're back moment. And I know it's out against a great team, but sometimes you can kind of get some of your mojo back just by beating a team you're better than and really showing it in the process. And Atlanta kind of feels like the opposite. And Atlanta's got some notable absences this weekend. Like Lucas McClamrock had like 3 blocks in that last Carolina game. He's been incredible for them this year. Him and Justin Burnett, probably their 2 best defenders, or that definitely you can make an argument for, are both not going to be playing. And for a Carolina team that struggled so much on offense against Atlanta, in big part because of what Lucas McClamrock was doing, it feels like that could be the difference. Like those 2 guys not being there might be something that Carolina can use to their advantage and really finding some footing offensively, where their last trip to Atlanta, I mean, it was, especially after the first quarter, it looked like it was just a slog trying to get anything started on offense.
Well, and another key absence, and someone that is out for the season after fracturing their shoulder against Houston a couple weeks ago, UFA legend Matt Smith, second all time in goals, will not be making another start for Atlanta this season and is a little bit in jeopardy of possibly stepping away after this. I feel like at this point in his career, an injury of that caliber, and especially at this point in the season, can just be so deflating, I think, not only for the individual, but the team as a whole. And we've talked numerous times on the show about what a secret sauce Matt Smith has been for his entire career. I mean, it wasn't so secret for a very long time, but I feel like the role he's inherited as he's become such like a veteran on-field captain for this team has been a little bit more within the mix of the system. But, he's been so central to the possession-based, high-tempo, I think, relief drives that accentuate and complement the deep attack of this Atlanta offense so routinely, and for him to be out in this matchup and knowing how central he was to Atlanta's offensive successes in their 25-19 win in their last meeting, it's going to be, I think, really interesting to see how Atlanta plays with these pretty notable absences, as you mentioned, with McClamrock and Burnett on defense and Smith on offense. But something that we've seen repeatedly for Atlanta is that they have gotten some really excellent, I think, performances from players that we're not traditionally used to in larger roles on this team. I think notably on defense, Tyler Randall and Aiden Downey have really emerged into sort of top level defenders for that hustle team. On offense, you have Hayden Austin-Knabb, who didn't play this last weekend, but is having a career year, in 2024 for the hustle. He's really emerged into kind of the all-around talent that we've known he's been in possession of for a few years now. Jeremy Langdon's having a career year. It feels like, well, maybe not quite career year because of his fantastic 2017 season with the Cannons, but one of his best seasons in his illustrious playing career. Like, there are still just a lot of pieces. And I think most notably for Atlanta, I think right now, if I just had to kind of pick off the top of my head an MVP, it's Halsmeyer right now, man. Like, especially after that moment last weekend, how he's held steady in all of their big matchups, how he just continues to do everything it feels like for this team when they need it. I mean, I know there are some questions about him in big games, but right now, for how he's playing this season, he's just knocking down all of those doubts.
Yeah, and he had his worst game of the season in that Carolina win, funny enough. He's going to have one of his best this week. I think, notably without Matt Smith, missing some defensive pieces, I think the margins are going to be much smaller than they were in that last Carolina matchup. And he's going to have to show up. I mean, you can really look at this as a playoff game, because whoever wins this game is going to, be able to skip the first round of the playoffs. You're essentially getting yourself into the division final just by winning this. So it's a big deal. We saw what Austin was able to do last year, where they largely were not that competitive with Carolina and Atlanta throughout the season. And then the playoffs hit and they were able to knock them both out. And while we've seen largely the same thing from Austin this year, I think we all know that Austin has the talent and ability to, show up in a one game scenario and win. And I don't think either one of these teams wants to have to find out what kind of Austin they're going to get in the first round of the playoffs. So uh, I do think that there is a lot of pressure on both sides to take care of business here.
It's felt like to this point in the season that Atlanta has taken things a little bit more seriously. I know that that's kind of a vibes based assessment, but along with Carolina's downturn and those disconcerting losses in the middle part of their year, it just is once again an end of season sort of gauging of this Flyers franchise that leaves me a little bit questioning. Last year they entered the playoffs as the 3 seed in the South. They lose on the road at Austin. They come into this year, they win their first 6 games. And yet I still feel kind of similarly as I did last year, even as in 2022, whereas if something kind of jumpstarts this team and really makes them play engaged, I still feel like they're an absolute title contender. And yet there's still just something not clicking. I don't know if it's, again, the rotation of lineups. I don't know if it's that they have so much talent that there isn't really a finisher for them at the end of some of these closer games. I don't know what it is, but there's something making me a little bit hesitant about feeling stronger for Carolina, despite them having a very good season. I mean, they're 9-2.
Yeah, and for all intents and purposes, still one of the best teams in the league. It's hard, I think, to try to be as objective as possible because there's so many factors to take into account, right? Like if you just look at those first 6 games, they looked incredible. They looked clearly head and shoulders above their competition. We know the talent that they have on this roster, but then when you look at the recent results, you wonder, like, are they trending in the wrong direction? And it's hard to know all the time how much it matters on a week to week basis. Sometimes I think we make more of it than we should, and then there are other times where it turns out we should have been making a bigger deal out of it than we were. And I do think, like, looking at who the Flyers have available for this game, I mean, this is about as strong as a roster as you can put out there. I see that Drew Swanson and Siraj Mataraju are out. I don't know necessarily if that's availability issue or I'm guessing they would at least be dressed, but they've got a really strong lineup out there, and like this 20, I mean, when you really look at it and you try to take it out of the context of the most recent games, I mean, I'd take that 20 against pretty much any other 20 and give them either the edge or give them close to a 50-50 shot of winning. So
Well,
I'm trying to look.
I want to set rosters aside. I don't think rosters really matter, like, in that sense. Like, both these teams are strong. I think it comes down to what they strategically execute with. You talk about Carolina again, in their most successful format, they're connecting on 8 to 12 hucks per game. I mean, you look at their results this season, when they're on, it's when they're attempting a lot of hucks and really pushing teams downfield and almost playing a little bit of field position through that lens as well. And then when they've struggled, most notably against Carolina, DC and Atlanta, they were just not able to sustain above, a 58% completion rate deep. And so I think it's kind of like teams that rely on the fast break and the 3 ball in the NBA, where in playoff mode, a lot of offense gets consolidated down to like half field sets. I think what it comes down to me is that I'd like to see Carolina execute a little bit more in there. I know that they can be really effective within the red zone, but I do feel like their tendency to shoot gets them a little bit susceptible to being taken advantage of if those deep looks aren't connecting, and especially against an Atlanta D-line that has been exceptional at converting breaks this season.
That is much better analysis. I like that. And I think you're right. And like, even now that you kind of put it that way, thinking about who they typically have out there on offense, it does feel like a lot of guys who either want to catch it under and then shoot deep, or that they want to be going deep themselves. Like, you think of a guy like Anders Jungst, who I think does that really well. But like, there isn't a lot of like guys upfield, I feel like, that want to just like catch the under and then just continue to the next easy pass. Like, they really are looking to stretch the field with the next throw, it seems like, pretty much every time they touch it. And that can be something that really clogs your offense up if you're not finding that next throw immediately. Well, okay, now I've spent 2 or 3 stalls looking deep downfield. Now I have to reset the disc, and our offense has come to a standstill again. Um, and you know what? I mean, if there's a game where they're going to be able to do that against Atlanta, I think this is the one, right? They're down McClamrock, down Burnett. Like, if you're going to take advantage of them in the deep space, missing those 2 guys is a great time to do it. So I know you don't want to talk about rosters, but if we're going to talk about the Hutt game, taking those 2 guys out of the equation in the deep space, that's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And McClamrock, especially as you mentioned earlier in this episode, he was dynamite in the last matchup between these two teams, and especially kind of disrupting that continuation flow that Carolina relies on so much. Like McClamrock's pressure on Jungst and some of the underneath matchups was vital in just stymieing whatever Carolina wanted to engage deep.
Yeah. I mean, the game's in Atlanta. I don't know. This feels like a toss up to me, though. Like, I favor, I thought Atlanta definitely had the edge going into the last game, but this one feels like a complete 50-50 to me. I don't have a leaning either way.
Well, and I think an interesting trend to watch in this game as well is that Atlanta, a team that we've celebrated as being the best hucking team in the league since the stat was invented in 2021, their past 3 games, they've kind of gone quiet on those deep balls. Against Houston on June 28th, they were just 6-9. And then on June 29th at Austin, just 4-9. And then this past weekend against Dallas, 7-9. I don't know if it was something specifically against those Texas teams that made the hustle kind of holster their normal deep ball, but it's just a little perplexing because then you take the 3 games before this recent 3-game stretch and they completed 10 plus hucks in each of those games. So just something to watch for Atlanta if they continue to shy away from the deep game versus a Carolina team that looks to really engage that third level of the field. Again, that game will take place at 7:30 p.m. on Saturday night on Watch UFA TV. We're moving a little bit unchronologically in this episode, so we're going to jump to the Friday matchups. And I think first up, the Central Division, again, do or die, win or be eliminated. I should put an asterisk there. There is a scenario in which Detroit beats Chicago on Sunday in the Mechanics' second game of the weekend, in which Chicago would lose a tiebreaker with which version is it? Is it with Madison losing? I can't keep any of these playoff scenarios correct.
So
If Madison loses to you guys and Detroit wins on Sunday versus Chicago, the Radicals do have a way to backdoor into the playoffs should they lose on Friday night at home. But
yes,
for all intents and purposes, Friday night is do or die. 6-5 Indy visiting 7-4 Madison. Madison having claimed 2 recent home game victories in their 3-game homestand to close out their 2024 regular season. You guys just picked up a thriller in Pittsburgh. I want to give you a moment to just kind of recap those events. Indy claws out from behind in the fourth quarter. The Cardiac Cats have been alive and well all season long. What has it been like to sort of be riding the rails of this roller coaster that you guys have been enduring the last few weeks?
Oh boy, where do I begin? So I think, and I said this, Lepler put it in the Tuesday toss, but offensively, I think a lot of us felt like in Pittsburgh, it was kind of the best movement we've had. Not necessarily the most efficient game we've had, but just in terms of like feeling like we're getting to our spots, people were able to continue on time, in rhythm. We've talked a lot this season. Coach Drew Shepard has talked a lot to us about like how many giveaways do we have versus how many takeaways does the other team have. And basically what we're meaning by that is, if we look at our turnover numbers, how many of those are generated by blocks from the other team versus how many of them are us throwing the disc away. And, Pittsburgh only had 4 blocks. We did not give them a lot of opportunities to affect our throws. And I think still for us, the issue can sometimes be what we call getting over our skis a little bit, which is where we're moving so quickly that we we're trying to move the disc so fast, and with the style of offense we're playing, that sometimes we get it and we see someone open and we just want to throw it to them so fast that occasionally, you lose a little bit of the focus that you need to make sure that the disc is, hitting them right in the gut. And, but yeah, I mean, we're feeling good there. And defensively, I mean, we just continue to generate blocks. We had 9 blocks in this game, which felt like an off night for us based on how the last several games have been going. But there was never a lack of confidence that we were going to win the game. Like that's, I think, why we're able to pull these 1-goal wins out, is because we go into all these tight games, after every quarter, whether we're, up a point or down a couple, and we firmly believe that it's our game. Like, we're going to win. So we don't get super tight at the end of those games, and we still have a looseness to us. And, we saved offensively our best quarter for the last quarter. We had a single turnover, which I believe was the very first point we played, and then didn't have another turnover the rest of the quarter. So we're lucky to have a lot of experience on our O-line too, guys who have been around for a while and have played in a lot of close games. And I think that obviously helps.
So speaking to that point, and I mentioned this on the recap episode that we last recorded with Daniel, there has been a lot of news swirling around about a core contingent of Alley Cats hanging up their cleats after this season. I mentioned 4 day one starters, but also I was reading that Levi Jacobs is a part of the pack that might be retiring after this season. That includes, again, Levi Jacobs, Cameron Brock, yourself, obviously, Rick
No,
Rose, Travis
not
Carpenter.
not Cameron Brock.
Not Cameron Brock.
No. I know I'm the oldest of the guys. Like, I
Okay,
am the oldest.
you have intimated some other stuff to me back and forth, but all right, we're taking Cameron Brock off there. I've heard on the Indy broadcast as well your name thrown into the mix. So
If they've thrown my name around, that is them speculating. I have never told
all right,
anyone
fake
on the
news,
broadcast.
fake news. So the contingent of possibly retiring after the season Alley Cats are Travis Carpenter, Nick Hutton, Rick Gross, Levi Jacobs. I have that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually, and I don't think this is like something that I'm like stealing away from them anywhere. This was basically like announced at like our final home game, but like, hey, this could be their final home game they ever play type deal. So yeah, I mean, guys are starting families or growing their families, and that's the thing about this league. So we all do this as a side gig, like, this is, we have jobs, we have families to take care of, like, all these things. And this is something that takes a lot of time and energy to do well, right? Like, I don't even know how many hours throughout the course of a full year, not, training on my own, let alone all the practices, the travel. Like, your whole summer is gone, right? Like, my family doesn't take summer trips to go places because I'm busy traveling for Frisbee. So we don't do family vacations in the summer. And, that can wear on people, and it's, they've been doing it for a long time. And, it gets to the point where you're like, there's other things I want to do in life. And, because we don't do this as our only, job, it's like we're working our 40 hours, and then you're doing another however many hours throughout the week with Frisbee. And then during the season, it just escalates. And, I have been fortunate enough to play with those guys for a long time. And, next year when I cleat up and don't see those guys around as much, it's going to be sad. I mean, they've been, Travis Carpenter has been a teammate of mine since 2012. Nick Hutton, I believe, since 2013. Rick Gross since 2014. I think Levi Jacobs, I think he was also 2014. So we're talking guys I've been teammates with for 10 plus years. It's wild. And for those that don't know, Rick Gross, I was thinking about this the other day, like, people who have maybe gotten into the UFA over the last like 5 or 6 years, you do not understand the like crazy athlete that Rick Gross like is and was. Man, we see Jeff Babbitt doing like he used to be the
Okay.
in
All
the
right.
year. No. Let me finish.
No,
Yeah,
Cam.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm
Let me
shutting
finish.
off the
No,
homerism
no,
right
no.
now. I like
When it
Rick
comes
Gross
to
as much as
winning
the
discs
next
in the
one.
air, when it comes to winning discs in the air, I saw that man win a disc in the air against Jeff Babbitt. So don't try to no Cam me. Like,
Oh, you can't just take one buzzer beater and say that proves it. Oh, come
no, I'm not
on.
saying he's better than Jeff Babbitt. I'm saying like that's the type of like gravity he had in a disc in the air situation. Like if it was Rick Gross and five dudes, I was taking Rick Gross, and I mean
You just
he
made the
proved that.
couple dozen podcast listeners we do have scratch their heads right now. So I just wanted to
Oh,
let you
come
know
on.
that.
You were there. You saw it.
I
Don't
wasn't,
act
in
like you
fact,
weren't.
there when you guys played Indy versus New York in the 2019 semifinals. I was watching remotely. So,
No, I'm
but I
talking
know the
about
claim
just
which you.
you saw the games in Madison. That's what I mean. Like, you saw him
Yeah,
in
no,
person.
Rick Gross is a fantastic athlete. I want to take nothing away from his accomplishments. I just think that there is levels to this. And when you put someone next to Jeff Babbitt, that's a certain kind of comparison to make, right? Like, it's the difference between comparing someone to a nice center and Shaquille O'Neal in his prime. Like that's what we're
Nice.
talking about with Jeff Babbitt and buzzer beaters. Like, sure, you might get one here or there, but you're not winning the majority. I mean, that's
I more
even what
meant like,
Ben Yacht talked about this at the beginning of his season on a podcast about
yeah.
how many times he went up against Babbitt in practices and how he never felt like he had an edge. He has a 5-inch or so height advantage on Babbitt, and he felt that way about Jeffrey. So anyways, we're way off the map here. I wanted to get us back on track to the Indy and Madison matchup. I appreciate everything that you're saying, and we'll absolutely have some time to debrief about the central core of this Alley Cats team losing a significant chunk of its heart. And I think I wanted to bring it up too because you were talking about this team's reliance on its chemistry and how that allows you guys to have such a high motor on the O line. And to that point, I wanted to talk about just kind of like the styles of these two teams, the Alley Cats and the Radicals, going into Friday night. You have the number 5 scoring team in Madison versus the number 7 scoring team in Indy. In the first meeting between these two teams, it was 23-22, Indy taking the win. But these two teams like to fill it up. You know this. You were just talking about getting out over the front of your skis. Both these teams really like to press issue and get things going. There's a very kind of frenetic pace that can take over the quality of these games. And I think in particular because both defensive units are playing so well and both defensive units have gotten so good at taking the disc away. The Radicals right now lead the league in break rate for the entire season, and your Alley Cats have been one of the most ferocious units in just getting blocks over the last month or so. And especially in their last meeting against Madison, Radicals had just 18 turnovers. Indy forced 17 of those through blocks. Big part of why Indy was able to come away with the 1-goal win. And then the other kind of data point that I really wanted to circle going into this, and I'm sure you know this front of mind, Indy has now won since the start of 2019, 3 of the last 4 meetings in Madison at Breese Stevens Field. And that is notable because if you've been following along with this league, it took until 2019 for Indy to win in that stadium. And so for you guys to kind of reverse a lot of the mojo of what the Radicals enacted upon you for the better part of a decade, I think will be really interesting to follow because right now, being up in the booth, being in that stadium, it's starting to feel a little bit like old Radicals magic. And yet, if you guys come in and douse the whole party and essentially eliminate them from the playoffs for the 6th straight season, that's going to be a kind of psychic twist or a psyche twist that is going to be hard for the Radicals to get over.
Yeah, I was not on at I think we actually lost 2 games in Madison in 2021 if I remember correctly, but I actually wasn't I have not personally lost in Madison since 2018. My last 3 games in Madison were 3 wins, and I hope that streak continues. Obviously, Madison has I mean, they looked incredible in their game against Chicago this weekend. I do think there was also a bit of Chicago looking a little bit in disarray. I don't want to take anything away from the Radicals' defense, but there were some a lot of questionable decisions and execution errors by Chicago, and
Sorry,
that
I wanted to jump in because I have to correct myself. I mentioned 3 of the past 4 meetings. It's 3 of the past 5. I misremembered the second matchup at Madison in 2021 that you were
yeah.
just talking about.
Yeah, and it was, I don't know, it was shocking. And you guys recapped this. I won't go too far into it. Just how good Chicago looked in Minnesota, and just how kind of disorganized they looked in Madison. And the thing, I don't think Madison did a lot to create a ton of those turnovers, but what they did do was absolutely take advantage of every single one of them, and that's what we have to watch out for, because like I just said, we have these moments offensively where we kind of get moving so fast that we almost kind of trip over our own feet, and then you know a mistake like that against this Madison team can just so easily turn into a break score. So for us, I mean, that's going to be the biggest key. It's like, yeah, sometimes we might have open guys and we might be able to move it really quickly, but we still have to have that intentionality behind every throw, even if we are trying to throw it quickly. Because the first and foremost thing we have to do before we worry about moving it quickly is making sure we're moving it correctly and like to the person, hitting them in the gut, and not, overshooting somebody, or, having a disc flutter to the ground. So, that's been the real strength of this Radicals team, right? It's been taking advantage of every opportunity they can to get a break score. And I think we had spots in our game against Madison and Indy where we turned a disc over, did not quickly enough transition to defense, and they were able to take advantage within a couple throws. So when we do turn it, it's going to happen. We just need to make sure that we're always prepared to play defense, because the way you can kind of stop their Radicals counterattack is by making sure that they're having to work the disc through more than 3 or 4 throws. They've kind of become a lot like how Minnesota's defense has operated for the last several years, where they get a turnover and they want to strike deep as fast as possible if it's there. And if you allow them to do that, you're just never going to catch up.
So one of the things that I found interesting listening to the Pittsburgh broadcast this past weekend, as y'all were facing off against them, was that the Thunderbirds announcers mentioned a similar sort of logic to how you've talked about in this podcast, teams who like to take a lot of deep shots but still complete a relatively large amount of them. The fact that if you're completing, 60% of 20 hucks, that's still kind of an abnormal amount of turnovers on those deep attempts. Pittsburgh's broadcast was similarly kind of describing how the Indy offense likes to complete a historic amount of passes in order to generate its momentum. And so there are kind of more opportunities for turnovers if you might complete 400 plus throws and have this sterling percentage of completions, and yet you still have a bulk rate of maybe 8 to 10 turns. That might be too many in a given matchup. And so I just kind of wanted to ask you about that going into a matchup again against a Madison team that leads the league in taking advantage of any kind of break opportunity it's presented.
Yeah, things are, I don't know. We've shored up a lot of things. The thing that's been so hard this year for us is that the offense has never really been the same week to week. Like, as we've been tinkering with this new style of play, every week we're like, hey, we're going to make this adjustment this week, or hey, we tried this and it didn't really work the way we wanted, so we're going to scratch that and do this other thing instead. And it's been a process, trying to figure out how to best run this new style of offense, and how to maybe marry some of the ideas we started with early in the season to maybe some more traditional ideas of how to run an offense. And I feel like we're in kind of the best spot of where we want to be right now. Like we've kind of melded, the worlds of, you guys alluded to like hex offense. We've kind of melded hex with like, traditional stacks, and been able, you've seen it in recent weeks. We've been able to strike deep more and with more intentionality and with more rhythm than we were early in the season. And it doesn't feel forced. Like early in the season, every deep shot felt like it was kind of forced. It felt like we only saw them if we were just like staring and trying to find one. Whereas now it feels like they're presenting themselves as opportunities within the flow of the offense. So I actually had someone on Twitter ask me about this, like, hey, like at what point essentially is there diminishing returns? Kind of, I guess, the same point you're getting at with how many completions you have and everything else. And it really just boils down to like, with more, if you're making more throws, you have to be completing at a higher percentage, right? So like if we're going to make 33% more throws than the other team, which is essentially what we do every game, 30 to 40% more throws than our opponents, then we need to be hitting at a higher percentage, right? To be able to keep up and stay level in the turnover battle. So, you know, some of those throws are about as low risk as you can get. I'll call them 99.9% completion throws. And so, yeah, it's another throw, but we're not really putting the disc in danger. It's when we start to move too fast and try to throw it before we're ready to throw it. That's where we have to avoid getting ourselves in trouble. Whereas Madison's turnovers, as you guys talked about, it's very intentional. A lot of them we're shooting deep. Oh, we didn't get it. Okay, well, we have time to set up the defense, and
Which
we're going
is
to be able to make them go full field.
It is in stark contrast to how the Radicals have struggled offensively the past several seasons, which is often like on mistaken handoffs in the middle of the field, a reset, a dump pass going errantly, and then they have to pick up in transition. And with their kind of melding of veteran and younger playmaker on those offensive lineups, they can sometimes get out of position in a hurry and really lead to some easy break scores. That hasn't been the case this year because, as your point was making, they're pushing the disc downfield and then they're able to kind of set up and allow opposing defenses to have to churn through the entire field to get a break score. You talked about some of Indy's offensive struggles earlier this year, and I would say to that point, you guys were experiencing something very similar to previous Radicals iterations, which is that you weren't turning the disc over downfield. It was on a little handoff exchanging, trying to ratchet across the field, and all of a sudden, the defense is running downhill at you. And it feels like a lot of those mistakes have kind of gotten ironed out over the last several weeks. And I think that that'll be really interesting against Radicals defense that continues to kind of camouflage its coverages. They run less and less zone than they've ever had in this team's history. They're really confident in two lineups of man-to-man defense they can play, one-on-one defense. And they just sort of get by with an extensive team knowledge of where they want to trap on the field and who they want to trap in particular. I feel like this Radicals defense, after having had a couple of seasons of up and down play on both ends, this year it really reveals that they do their homework as well as any team as far as identifying, okay, here's a point in which I think we can really break through. I think you saw it last weekend against Chicago. The Union implemented a non-starter on their offense, and that was like the absolute levee breaking moment in which the Radicals leaned on early in the game to get their break train rolling. I feel like they're going to try to do something similarly against you guys, but as you've mentioned, Indy's, I think, a little bit less vulnerable in those ways. You guys have such an understanding of what you like to do on offense and can get into those rhythms so quickly that it presents a challenge for a Radicals defense that relies on kind of making you do the thing that you don't want to do. You guys are versatile enough to kind of handle the rerouting that Madison's defensive coverages often make opposing offenses do.
Yeah, and I think, we haven't really talked about the flip side of this matchup, but, I think offensively for Madison, like Anthony Gutowski's been having such a great season, and especially recently also not turning the disc over. That's a point. It's probably a point of emphasis for any team, but I think it's just one of those things where we want Gutowski to also fill up on empty calories, if you will, right? Like we would love for him to catch the disc.
He's the opposite though, man. He might be the most efficient player in the league at simply doing what he does best. I was kind of talking about that with Chris Pennant from Chicago on the broadcast last week, which was that it feels like he just exists in the end zone. You look at his stats and he's barely got touches outside of that area. He's kind of just catching goals and not doing much else as far as his involvement. And normally I think you'd kind of maybe critique that sort of single dimensionness, but you look at the tape and it's just undeniable the kind of impact Gumby has had in his second year in the association.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things. I mean, I can relate to this. I think in 2013, I always make the joke, and we don't have great stats from back then. It's kind of hard to tell how accurate the like completion and throwing stats are. Um, but I always make the joke that I think I may have caught the disc in the end zone more times than I caught it outside of the end zone that season, and that very much feels like the way Gumby is playing, where it's like, yeah, I could catch the disc over here for 10 yards, but why not just go 30, 40 yards downfield and catch it in the end zone instead? And to your point, he's doing that with about as good of efficiency as anyone in the entire league. And I think him and Alec Wilson Holiday are kind of battling it out for the goals, record, or not record, but the goal leader for the year. And, he's got the edge right now, I think. Or no, did Alec Wilson Holiday overtake him again?
Alec Wilson Holiday overtook him, but Gumby, given the way that he's been scoring lately, could leapfrog him once again. Alec Wilson Holiday still has one more game, as well as Gutowski, to see who will end up for the league leading goal title at the end of the 2024 season. That will be something to watch for definitely in this game, but I think just more than anything, as we mentioned at the top, this is essentially do or die, win or go home for both Indy and Madison. Again, Indy 6-5, Radicals 7-4, playing at Breeze Stevens Field. Cannot wait to call that game alongside Colin Camp in the booth and see you as well in person. First time since we started this podcast, I think I actually get to face-to-face with you. And so that'll be really exciting. And then we get to actually celebrate whatever the result of Indy versus Madison is with our last preview game on this episode, the Class of the West Coast, Seattle at Salt Lake on Friday night on WatchUFA.tv. This game will determine the overall 1 seed in the West, barring that Seattle drops their Sunday matchup against Portland. Cascades come into this game as one of the hottest teams in the league. Salt Lake was the second to last undefeated team this season, but they've gone through a series of injuries and just question marks about some of their performances against contenders that I think leaves them as the most susceptible team with this many wins at this point in the season. For a Shred team that came into 2024 winning at home in their home opener against DC, a win that looks more and more impressive, honestly, as the season wears on. It felt like it was all but clinched that the Shred would kind of ride their talent, home field momentum into hosting the West Division Championship game and then potentially hosting and lifting a trophy in front of their fans at championship weekend later this summer. And now, with the way that Seattle has been playing and with their star and talent and with their depth and with their defense, this Scades team presents a real challenge for the Shred even before we get into the playoffs. And so I think that it will be all important for the Shred to win this game, because it's just a little unfathomable to think that Salt Lake would host a first round game against Oakland and then have to go to Memorial Stadium to face the Scades for the potential West Division title.
Did you see who's active for Salt Lake? Did you see it?
Did something change since the beginning of this episode?
Will Selfridge listed as active, hasn't played.
Oh, yeah, that is a change since the beginning of this episode, because I was going to talk about, we just learned from this past weekend, Joe Merrill went down with an injury, and as Evan Lepler reported on his Tuesday Toss article, will be out for the season with an ACL tear. Just terrible news for any fan of the sport. I mean, I feel like Joe Merrill is one of the most likable players around. He just kind of brings indefatigable positive spirit. And so to have a player like that get eliminated at this point in the season just feels just shy of heartbreak. But that's a very big development. I mean, Selfridge hasn't played in over a month.
2 months. Last game was May 18th, which he played the first 3 games of the season. We haven't seen him since. I heard rumblings of an injury he was dealing with, and I hope he's back to 100% and good to go. I'm assuming he is if he's playing in this game. But we talked about how the Salt Lake Shred offense just felt like it was missing something, and how Will Selfridge felt like that piece that was missing. They haven't really looked like themselves offensively for the better part of a month or so at this point, and I think this could be the spark plug that kind of reignites the offense. I'm really excited to see what kind of impact he has on the game. One thing that can happen if you don't play a game for 2 months, no matter how much, especially when you're dealing with an injury, no matter how much you try to replicate like being ready physically for a game, once you actually get into game action, it does, take a toll on your body that you can't really prepare for in any other way. So we'll see what kind of usage he gets if he's out there for the whole game or if they have him kind of maybe on a points restriction. But I'm excited because I honestly, like, before I saw that he was playing, I felt like pretty confident that like Salt Lake, that Seattle was really the favorite in this game, the way they've been playing and the way they've kind of been ratcheting things up. But this Will Selfridge appearance on the lineup really kind of evens the playing field for me. I mean, I think this could be kind of the key to seeing the Salt Lake team that we saw at the beginning of the year.
Jordan Kerr is also scheduled, I believe, to have the cast off of his non-throwing hand in this matchup. That would be the first time in about a month since when he sustained the injury that he will be playing without that cast. So something to watch forward to there. And as you mentioned with Selfridge, I mean, we came out of that week 1 game having a little bit of a hypothetical question about who might be the best player at their peak for the Shred offense. And given how Selfridge performed against DC, and given how he's generally performed when he's been available, he's clearly been an X factor in allowing the Shred team to reach its full potential. And so, yeah, you hope his reinsertion will bring them back to that point. I know Selfridge is one of the most disciplined athletes when it comes to preparation and getting back to game speed. But to your point, I mean, getting out in the field for a real game is something that you can't prepare for until you're out there. I remember talking with Kevin Pettit-Scantling this past weekend after he made his first appearance in almost 2 years. And he was saying the same thing. End of that first quarter back, he was just turning to a Radicals teammate and saying, when did these get so long? I don't remember them being this long. And it's to your point of there's just a different, it's like playing in a Dragon Ball Z gravity chamber or something. Once you're out there on the field, it just feels different from how you run around and practice and everywhere else. I don't know how else to encapsulate it other than to say many players have come up and said the same thing that you're saying.
Yeah, it's that's why I actually hate whenever we have weeks off during the season. Like once we're in, I kind of like to just go. And luckily this year, I think we only had 1 week off after playing our first game. So because like you take a couple weeks off and then you come back into a game, it's almost like the first quarter is just like readjusting to playing in a game again. And I wanted to touch on the Jordan Kerr cast coming off thing because I mean, this has clearly affected him. He in his last 3 games, which have been the 3 games he played with the cast on, he has a total. Now, I'm just going off of completion, so this doesn't count. So he scored 2 goals. I'll take that into account. So he has a total of 35 touches in the last 3 games. 35. He averaged, before the cast, somewhere around 30 touches, like 28 to 30 touches a game. The cast has clearly like had an effect on his ability to kind of get involved in the offense and get the disc in his hands. Him having that off seems like the best thing. Like that in tandem with Selfridge coming back seems like rocket boosters are about to be put on the Salt Lake team.
Yeah, and yet the kind of quiet strength of the Seattle team all season has been their ability to get breaks. I mean, that's what won them the game that clinched their playoff spot when they beat the Summit at home a couple weekends ago. They currently sit just behind the Radicals for the second leading break rate in the entire UFA, and they've just been able to kind of rotate in pieces that continually build pressure against West Division offenses. And I'm interested to see if Seattle can learn from what New York did against Salt Lake and sort of denying those first few throws, because this Cascades team, the past 2 times they've showed up at Salt Lake, were radically different. The first ever meeting between these 2 teams was in Salt Lake's first ever home opener. Cascades were defeated 32-21 by the Shred in that game. Just
Yep.
absolute melting of the away team by the Shred. Last year, also in the home opener, Salt Lake getting a 28-20 win. So 60 total goals put up in the first two matchups at Zions Bank Stadium against the
Yeah.
Cascades. I don't think it's going to play out the same way in Week 13 on Friday night. I think the Cascades are going to have something more to say, and I'm interested to see if they can affect the same sort of, again, defensive pressure that they've done against some of the lesser offenses in the West Division.
Yeah, this Cascades team is tough on defense. Like, we can go. This is a complete team. Like, this team is great on offense. They're great on defense. They're the best hucking team in the league in terms of completing hucks. They average the most breaks per game of any team in the league. They have they're third in blocks in the league. I mean,
well, and with Kerr coming out of a cast, with Grant Lindsley having some down performances, Seattle stands to have, and even if all things were full strength anyways, Seattle might have the best player in this game in Khalif El Salam, who stands to figure to be a big part of the Cascades efforts.
yeah, and this Seattle team, they can go kind of guy for guy with a lot of rosters across the league. I mean, that's been something we've touched on a few times, but coming into this season, I just don't think any of us had any idea how impactful the full roster was going to be. We looked at guys like Garrett Martin and Khalif El Salam and maybe a Zeppelin Ronig and thought they've got some dudes, but we've seen just contributions all over the place. We've seen great performances from a lot of different players. Obviously, Lucas Ambrose coming over and continuing to just terrorize every offense he plays against. I mean, don't even talk about who the best player might be. Like, if we made a top 10 players in this game, we might have 7 of them be coming from Seattle the way they've been playing this year. It's been really impressive.
That's a hot take. All right. I'm not disagreeing with it. Garrett Martin gets a revenge game against the Salt Lake team they played for in 2022, was a big part of that route against the Cascades in the Shred's first ever home game. You mentioned Lucas Ambrose being such an important addition. He's currently leading the league in blocks, trying to become just the first player in league history to lead in back-to-back seasons. He led with LA last year. He still currently leads with Seattle this year. The rookie Jasper Dean, he's been phenomenal as both a defender and on the counterattack for the Cascades. Mikey O'Brien coming over from Pittsburgh, he's been a two-way force. He just seems to be able to make a play whenever they need it. He doesn't have a ton of throwing, but he's a big body and just plays well in transition, which is where this Seattle defense really excels. Tony Goss, the second-year player, has gotten a ton of big layout blocks in the handler rotations and has been a big spark plug at beginning of games and just sort of is kind of a talisman for a Seattle team that feeds off of big energy. Like, you can just keep going. I did want to mention notable absences for Seattle because we mentioned Joe Merrill for Salt Lake. It's great to hear Will Selfridge will be returning. For the Cascades, they'll be down Tommy Lee, who notably caught the layout game winner against Colorado to punch Seattle's first playoff ticket since 2016. He will not be available in Week 13, along with Derek Morad, who hasn't been available for a couple of games. He was syncing up with Christian Foster in the backfield of that Seattle offense and maybe being one of the best 1-2 deep throwing tandems. He won't be available. And then 2 of the big rookie emerging performers for Seattle and players to watch going forward for several years, Cedar Hines and Leahy. I forget his first name. It's Gavin Leahy. They won't be available. Leahy has been a big part of Seattle's just sort of stability on offense. He's a terrific fill cutter. And Cedar Hines has made some fantastic plays as a rookie teenager for the Scades. He's going to be on the U20 national team. Definitely a player to watch for years to come. Those 4 players will not be able to go for Seattle. And yet you still look at their lineup and it's really formidable.
Yeah, I mean, if And that's the biggest thing about the Seattle team compared to past seasons, right? Is it used to be you take two or three guys that are maybe two of the three better players off the roster, you'd be like, well, they just don't have a chance to win this weekend. And now we're at a situation where, yeah, it stinks that they don't have those guys, but there's still so much talent across the board. They've got 4 or 5 guys in this roster with double-digit blocks this year. Uh, the offense just hums. Like, I'm so excited because if Salt Lake's offense can kind of find its footing the way it did early in the season with the re-addition of Selfridge and with Kerr with the cast off, we could be looking at a game that's just highlight play after highlight play, like just two offenses just taking it to one another. And I think this is going to be like, of all the games this weekend, this one I think has the most entertainment potential. Like, with just not only how great these offenses can be, but the way that both defenses just fly around and throw their bodies around. This, you could probably almost make a top 10 plays just from this game by the time it's over.
I think Seattle's going to run Khalif and Ambrose together on defense, which is going to be quite the 1-2 punch, especially with Ambrose and Kerr locking up a number of times last season for some really thrilling matchups. It felt like Kerr got the better of Ambrose in those games, but Kerr's still coming back from an injury. I wonder if Ambrose will be deployed in the backfield a little bit more. I know they like to leave him downfield because he's such a terrific help defender and can cover sideline to sideline. Sort of like a dream safety to just have in the canopy over the top of your defense. But I feel like if you can disrupt the rhythm of the Salt Lake throwers, as has been shown a couple of times, that's where you get the most effectiveness. And so can they find a matchup for Jacob Miller, Sean Cannell, Luke Jorgensen that will get them some blocks? I think Jasper Dean might also be a part of that solution. He, with his frame and his height and his size, he's been so terrific at shutting down throwers on the mark. So just a lot of things I think to pay attention to. Many moving parts in this matchup between Seattle and Salt Lake on Friday night. That will do it for the formal preview part of this episode in this Week 13 Outlook. I just wanted to mention a couple other notable items. We sort of mentioned it at the top of the episode, but Boston currently sitting with the inside track to number 1 in the East Division and a home game playoff for that divisional title. But they first have to win at Toronto and Montreal. Those are by no means gimme games, even though those two Canadian teams have combined for just 3 total wins in 2024. Montreal put a fright into Boston just under 2 weeks ago. They could do it again on the second day of a back-to-back heat. And just, I think, lethargy or fatigue is something to watch for as we work into this part of the season. So if Boston drops one of those games, or heaven forbid, both of them, you could see some real opportunism from either DC and maybe even New York in seizing that number 1 overall seed heading into the East Division playoff bracket. So something to watch for there. And then I mentioned a couple times too, Seattle will actually conclude their season, their regular season schedule, on Sunday at Portland. So even if they do win on Friday against the Salt Lake Shred, they do still have to take care of business on Sunday as well. That will be interesting to look forward to. This, again, as we've kind of hyped up numerous times, is fleshing out to be, I think, the most anticipated regular season finish we've ever had. And at this point, I don't really have a whole bunch more words to say. I wanted to give the mic over to you for just a second. If you have any parting thoughts going into your matchup, or just kind of having a moment to look on the league at this point where we are entering the final regular season weekend and there is so much excitement. I feel like this has been a lurch period so many years prior. Maybe you just kind of wanted to speak for a second on that.
Yeah, so first thing I want to do is shout out Alec Wilson-Holiday, because he's currently leading the league in plus minus, and through a little bit of research, there has never been a player who's been on a team that's been this far at the bottom of the overall league standings that's been able to lead the league in plus minus. And I found that really fascinating. Typically those players aren't even in like the top 10 of plus minus. So I just, an interesting development. So shout outs to him, obviously having a great individual season despite, a lack of team success. But to your point about what's going on in the league right now. Yes, I've played in every season and have been intimately aware of like all of the different playoff scenarios as we've entered the ends of all of those seasons. And this is truly unprecedented what we're seeing in terms of how much is at stake in this final week of the season. It's even like, and the great thing about this weekend in particular is that there are intriguing matchups all 3 days, because even going to that Boston-Montreal game on Sunday, which if Boston stumbles and doesn't take care of business there, they could find themselves possibly all the way down at the 3 seed. I think there's like still a way that can happen, even if they only lose one game, depending on how things shake out in the other game. And I just hope that everyone like has fun this weekend, man. Like everyone, like all of you out there who love Frisbee and love seeing games that matter. This is the week. I mean, this is the week it really matters. I mean, you can find some intrigue in just about every matchup across the board. Even like looking at like an Austin at Dallas game where it's just like, does Dallas avoid being the only winless team in the league? I mean, even that's a little intriguing for me, on top of the fact that we have like 6 different games that heavily impact playoff scenarios. So enjoy it, and we'll do our best to recap all the madness when we come back from this weekend.
I mean, we are just 4 short days away from only having 12 teams remaining. We currently have 10 teams with their playoff tickets punched, but we are waiting the final 2 in the Central Division. But we'll be bidding adieu to another handful of teams. I know Houston and Colorado have already wrapped up their regular season schedules, but this will be our last time taking in a good deal of the league, a full half of it. And then we move on into this brutal postseason, which just figures to be the most up in the air playoff affair this league has ever seen. I can't really even compare it to another year. It even felt like in 2021, when we had a pretty historic slate of contenders, there was still a lot of intrigue heading into that with a 4-loss Flyers team that ended up taking the whole dang thing. So I think you're going to see something very similar as we round into this year's version of the postseason. But first and foremost, we've got to get through the most exciting final weekend in regular season history. We can't wait to tune in alongside you on WatchUFA.tv Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night all weekend long. Again, you can catch Indy and Madison, Seattle and Salt Lake on Friday night, DC at New York for the game of the week on Saturday night, as well as that South Division showdown between Carolina and Atlanta. That will be on Saturday night as well. That'll do it for Cam and I for now. We'll be back with you to recap all of it and then excitedly set up the 2024 UFA playoffs. We are just over 1 month away from championship weekend taking place out in Salt Lake City, Utah on August 23rd and 24th. The road is really starting to get underway. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.
Oh, he's getting the crowd going.
Are you kidding me? You are kidding me! Holy smokes! Was there any doubt? Was there any doubt?
This is going to be the game. Joe Clutton battling for position. He tips it to the end zone.